The Committee for Campus Inclusion was created in 1990 at Arizona State University. The mission of CCI is to create and maintain a civil and just campus environment that values diversity, promotes respect for all individuals regardless of their status, protects free speech and academic freedom, and promotes the pursuit of individual goals without interference from discriminatory harassment. CCI continues to advance this mission through educational experiences, essential to an institution of higher education. Furthermore, we recognize and celebrate those who are working to further the vision of diversity and inclusion, while also providing recommendations to the Vice Provost for inclusion and community engagement on issues related to diversity and inclusion. While diversity addresses the number of individuals that represent a range of human differences, inclusion encompasses creating a welcoming environment where all persons within our university community can thrive and succeed as articulated through our university charter. Welcome to today's episode, Inclusion and Technology from the Make Me Your Voice podcast, sponsored by ASU's Committee for Campus Inclusion at the Tempe campus. As such, today's program focuses on our difficulty to reconcile with the feeling of being uncomfortable, and how we can progress after recognizing our own privileges. Our two guest speakers are Renee Bhatti-Klug and Drew Ross. Renee Bhatti-Klug is a senior University International Educator in the Office of the University Provost at ASU. She has led numerous workshops regarding culturally inclusive classrooms. Drew Ross is an Associate Director in the International Students and Scholars Center at ASU. Drew works to ensure the academic success and ease of transition for international students at ASU.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Renee Bhatti-Klug, and I serve as ASU's University International Educator. I provide training to faculty and staff on intercultural competence through the lens of cultural intelligence. And this is on behalf of our culturally and linguistically diverse students. I want to say hi to my colleague, Drew.
Hello, everyone. My name is Drew Ross, and I'm an Associate Director in the International Students and Scholars Center. The ISSC serves our international student community, including our students and scholars, and provides them with compliance support with their immigration status, as well as cultural, professional, and communication support as well during their time here at ASU.
Great. And Drew and I work often together, and we've become friends over the years, and since both of us are in this space of diversity and inclusion. And so, Drew, thank you so much for doing this today. And today our topic is, are you uncomfortable yet in a conversation on diversity and inclusion? So, Drew, there's a lot to be uncomfortable about right now.
That's an understatement, wouldn't you say?
It is. So to put this in context, we have COVID-19 happening. Drew and I are working from our respective homes over Zoom. There's a lot of, it's July of 2020, so there's some political stuff happening. There's a lot of racial discord that, of course, has been happening for hundreds of years, but it's come to the forefront with the final, I think, event of George Floyd's death, or what I would say his lynching. And then finally, we even have an issue of discord over whether or not to wear masks. There's a lot of discord and there's a lot of uncomfortability.
Absolutely.
And then we come into our work of diversity and inclusion, how to make people feel seen, how to make them feel included, how to move past our discomfort. So before we move into the conversation about why being uncomfortable is actually a good thing, what do we mean by culture?
I think that's a really hard word when we throw that out there, Renee, because it means a lot of things. And in the work that we've done, it's sometimes hard to pin down a definition of culture, right?
Yeah.
And when you ask someone what culture is, they will say, oh, it's how people dress or how people speak or the food they eat, right? And there are so many aspects of our cultures that people can see, and they can see very easily. And so they will say, oh yes, I know their culture based on how they're speaking to me or the dress that they are wearing, right? But there's so much about culture too that we don't know, that is below the surface, if you will. You know, if you use an iceberg model, for example, an iceberg has so much that is a part of the iceberg that is actually below the surface of the water. And that's just like culture too, right? There are beliefs, there are values, there are traditions, all of those things that we don't know, we can't understand just by looking at someone about what their culture is. And I also think sometimes when we talk about culture, we say the word culture, sometimes we just mean kind of those ethnic or national sort of cultures. You know, I'm an American, or I'm an Indian, I'm a Canadian, and those are our cultures. But even those of us here in the United States that may identify as an American, we don't share all of the same cultures, right? There are so many different aspects. We have a culture of our family, we have a culture of our community, the culture of our religious affiliations, the culture of our sporting interests, right? There's so many different things that make up our cultures. We can't just say, oh, this group of individuals, they all share the same culture, because we all are so different in the way that we celebrate and acknowledge our cultures.
Yeah, correct. I like to use the example of December 25th. So let's just say all of us at ASU, we get that day off. And for some of us, it's to celebrate Christmas in terms of worshiping Jesus. For others, it's celebrating Christmas in terms of providing gifts to family through Santa Claus. For other people, it's a fantastic day of rest, right? And for others, it doesn't mean a whole lot. And so I say a lot to people, look, just because somebody says, you know, for people to say because we get December 25th off makes us automatically a Christian culture is just not true. That maybe the majority might identify as being Christian and we might get this day off for that reason. But it would be unfair to say, oh, they're all Christian. And so I think a big part of culture too is making sure that we're not defining people just by their culture. People define cultures. Cultures don't necessarily define people, if you will.
Sure, and I hear that point, but then you sort of have to wonder why. You know, institutions like ASU, not every staff member gets off for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, right?
Yeah.
But
Yes.
the entire university shuts down for Christmas, quote unquote. So I think there is a preference in some sort of spaces where certain cultures are more universal, if that's for lack of a better word, then might be some others.
I agree. And I will say I did teach in New York, and there was a very large Jewish community, and we did get Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur off, to be fair. But I think there are a lot of things that we need to re-examine right now to see what cultures we are going to try to serve, what communities we're going to try to serve, and that might have to influence how our calendar goes. I think that you make a really, really good point.
And I think that this kind of discussion kind of leads us into this idea of being uncomfortable, right?
Yes.
We're some of us are comfortable with the status quo, if you will, where we all get December 25th off, and that makes sense to us. And someone may say, well, I don't celebrate Yom Kippur, so I don't need that day off work, right? But flip that story, you know, that a person who doesn't celebrate December 25th may not understand why we can't also have Yom Kippur off as well. So how do we learn to be uncomfortable, or why is it so important to be uncomfortable?
I think that being uncomfortable is the first start to engaging with people who are different, or engaging diversity. And diversity is when you have multifaceted elements, but inclusion is being willing to see everybody and to be able to say, okay, we all belong. We all belong. And then of course we have the ideas of equity and equality and things like that, and how they're not the same. You know, equality, of course, is treating everybody the same way, but equity is that sense of fairness, that if you do treat everybody the same way, is it going to actually be equal? And we know that that's not true. Not everybody has the same access. We use the Martin Luther King idea of bootstraps. It's fine to say everybody's got to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but if not everybody has boots, it's a little bit hard to do.
Or if not everyone has straps.
Yeah, or no straps, exactly. And so all of these kinds of things. And so I think being uncomfortable sometimes allows us to say, oh, I didn't realize that I was in this position of power or privilege and that person wasn't, and I was making judgments about that person. Mm-hmm. Or I didn't realize that this was a problem in my nation or in the world. I've never thought of it. I've never been impacted by it. And it's a little strange. It's uncomfortable for me to think about this issue of racism or politics or religion or ethnic diversity or gender identity, all of these things.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think we are uncomfortable with being uncomfortable?
I don't know, Drew. Why don't you answer that question first?
Well, I wanted to share the quote that you discovered, if I may.
Yes.
And I'm not probably going to pronounce this gentleman's last name correctly, but Thomas Opong from mission.org said, "Discomfort is a catalyst for growth. It makes you yearn for something more. It forces you to change, stretch, and adapt." So is the idea then that we are uncomfortable with growth?
Yeah. I think, we have like Carol Dweck and the growth mindset, and or even Angela Duckworth with the grit conversation, which all of those can be controversial. This idea, though, that these ideas are taking shape, even Brene Brown with her vulnerability research. So all of these ideas are if you will, new to the last 10 years, let's say, maybe 20. So this idea that we need to have more growth or more grit or more vulnerability and to say that these ideas are new would be to say that the status quo is that we haven't understood how to grow. We haven't understood how to have grit, or even what that is, if you agree with this idea. Or we don't want to engage in vulnerability because is it that we want appearances? Is it that we want to feel, is it that we want to feel safe? Is it that we grew up knowing what we knew and who we knew and the idea we thought of ourselves, and anything that would call that into question would either require too much of us? Is it work to move out of discomfort? These are all just questions I'm asking, but.
Yeah. I said I wasn't going to share a personal story, but now I feel like I'm going to. But I guess I just remember the moment I decided to leave sort of the bubble of North America for the first real time in a significant way and put myself in a place where I was not in the majority for the first time, really. And I don't think I understood that I was actually a part of a majority with such privilege until I became a part of the minority and wasn't able to use that same privilege anymore. And that was definitely has been a defining experience for me. And I think it's definitely led me into the work that I do today, in wanting to support people from the vast cultures that are represented here at ASU. But I think from my personal experience, I just remember that for those people that are part of the majority, or part of the group that feels that they have privilege, it's not an easy internal conversation with yourself to recognize that you inherited this privilege because of who you are, and then if you want to work against it, or if you want to challenge that privilege, you have to make intentional choices to have conversations with others and with yourself to negotiate what that privilege looks like for you moving forward. But it goes back, it's not a comfortable conversation to have with yourself when you realize that you have that and others don't.
It's true. And I want to talk about privilege, but before we do, like, talk to me about how you negotiated your maybe loss of privilege in your new culture that you moved to outside of North America, and what were your biggest takeaways in coming back to North America and then serving people who were here from other nations?
I was a teacher, and I was teaching in a small island in the South Pacific, and it became very apparent to me as I attended staff meetings or even department meetings with my colleagues, and the majority of these meetings were conducted in the native language of this island, which I knew words here and there, but definitely was not fluent, had not studied the language significantly prior to going to this area. And that, again, maybe something to discuss too, because there's a privilege in thinking that you could just go into a country without the language skills, right? So there's lots to unpack here, but just remembering that I didn't understand the language, and and there was an initial expectation of, well, these people speak English, so why aren't they having this meeting in English? You know, and I just at first was getting very uncomfortable and upset, and, well, why am I even here? I don't understand what they're saying. Are they doing this because they're talking about the people who don't speak Samoan or whatever it was? And I think it just took time. It took a really long time while I was there for me to just get to a place where I said to myself, I'm going to attend this staff meeting. I'm not going to know what they're saying, and that is okay. And that it took a long time, because I'm someone, and you know me, Renee, I like information. I like to gather lots of data and figure things out. I'm not someone who just goes and does things, willy-nilly, but for me to sit there and just be okay, well, I'm not going to know, and maybe I'm going to miss out of things because I don't know, but that has to be okay, and it was really hard, but it was important, because it reminded me that I'm not in a space where I can where I can sort of say, no, you need to be doing it this way, because then it comes back to that idea of a better, us versus them. Well, this way is better, or my ways of doing it is better. This is their way. And I had to learn what their way was,
Yeah. So you bring up thank you for sharing that, Drew, but you bring up two really important things. We talk about privilege, and I think even the conversation about privilege is uncomfortable. It triggers people. As social media, you mention privilege, and people are either going to block you, or they're going to type at you, or they're going to do something. And then the second thing that you mentioned that I would argue is a real way out of the feeling of uncomfortableness that you kind of evinced with your story is the idea of adaptability. That our willingness to adapt allows us to move past the discomfort, that we don't say no to the discomfort. We say, okay, I'm uncomfortable, but I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to keep attending the meetings, as you said. I'm going to, maybe for some, it's to learn the language. I'm going to recognize, where I'm at fault here and where I'm not at fault, and I'm going to seek to do something about it. And I think that's really important. But when we talk about privilege, which I know is a trigger for a lot of people, I like to remind people of what privilege is and what privilege is not. And I think in looking at what privilege is, it's a right, a favor, an advantage, it's immunity, and it's especially granted to one individual or group, and this is really important, it's withheld from another. So the idea that it's lucky that people see us not for our color, or we're lucky we don't get stared at every single time we enter into a room, or we're lucky we don't get followed by security when we go to the store. All right, these are types of statements that would be made by people who have privilege on behalf of those who do not. But what privilege does not mean is that an individual is immune to life's hardships. And I think that's what I hear the most is, well, wait a minute, I grew up poor. I grew up, so maybe you are in the power structure. So for the United States, it would be white, cisgender male. By cisgender, it means you're biologically male. And that is the gender identity that you still assume. maybe socioeconomically you have more wealth, maybe you have more education, perhaps you're a leader, and again, power structures would say maybe you're married with children. So if you, and Christian, I think, if I didn't mention that, if you are part of any of those identities or all of them, you have more privilege in the United States. Different cultures would assume different identities. And so yes, that's not to say that you didn't have a hard life, but it means that you didn't have any hardships based on any of those identities. And you did not necessarily experience hardship based on your race, gender, social class, ability, or religious affiliation. And I think that that's an important thing to let people know in owning privilege. Because a lot of people don't want to, because they think that somehow if I own privilege, I'm somehow responsible for all of these problems.
Yeah, and I'll share another story, not to make this too storytelling, but I think a recent example where I became, again, a parent of my own privilege. As you know, Renee, I traveled to Florida recently with a friend of mine, and we drove across the country. And, as we were driving, we were taking turns driving, and, open road, Texas, middle of nowhere, I decided to go much higher over the speed limit, probably 20 miles per hour over the speed limit. And I had no issues with that. My friend, who was African-American, did not feel as comfortable doing that because he was nervous that if he were to get pulled over for speeding, he didn't want that experience. I don't think of that experience when I'm driving and speeding, that I'm going to potentially have an uncomfortable situation with a police officer because of that. My friend does. And so that was an example of me saying, oh, I didn't even think of that, and I guess I should have, and that shows, maybe my lack of sort of forethought, especially as we talk about police right now. But it was just another reminder of, I have this sense, this confidence in that I can have a friendly conversation with a police officer and to get out of a speeding ticket if I needed to, because of who I am.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And I really admire that you're owning that yeah, it is uncomfortable to remember when you're with a friend that you have something that they don't have based on the color of their skin. And yet you've talked about how you moved out of that uncomfortability. So it seems, in listening to you, that your reflexive response was, yeah, I'm going to own that. Did it feel uncomfortable for you to realize that you had this privilege, or are you at this point now where you're okay with uncomfortability and saying, oh yeah, I am a recipient of this power?
It's tricky because it's definitely accepting that you have it. There's a sense of guilt that I have a lot too at times. I wish it wasn't this way. I wish that I couldn't have this privilege, or I wish that someone else who did have a different sense of privilege. And so that is uncomfortable, right? Mm-hmm. Coming to terms with the fact that you have this guilt, or you wish things were different. And again, it's not trying to whitewash it or, colorblind the experiences of people of color, but you just get to a sense of where sometimes it doesn't make sense to me. I don't want it to be this way. I don't want my friend to not speed, but I can speed. And I know that's a simple kind of statement, but it doesn't seem right. And as I come to terms with this, it inspires me to want to do more, to have those conversations, to say to people, you are doing this. I had a conversation with my mother when I was in Florida. She's very, anti-racism. Oh, people don't understand the experiences of people of color. And she talks about that. But when I challenge her to say, but what are you doing, Mom? What are you actually saying? Are you watching 13 on Netflix? Are you watching When They See Us on Netflix? Are you watching Malcolm X? And she said no to all of that. And so even for someone who identifies as being someone who thinks racism is bad, isn't going that next step, And so how do we keep that conversation going?
That's so good. And I think that that's a great segue into the next step of how to, that yes, there are, so the way that I kind of like to teach it is through the lens of cultural intelligence, which is just our ability to interact effectively with people from other cultures. And one of the first element is curiosity. Do you have a sense of cultural openness? And the second is awareness. Like, are you able to feel for another culture in order to gain a sense of knowledge about them? And how we do that is exactly like you were saying. And this is the work of just not being a racist versus being an anti-racist. And being an anti-racist is not just a black and white. Anti-racism is not a black and white issue. Anti-racism is an issue that includes all people from minority communities. And so in working, in doing that, are you getting to know, what does your friendship circle look like? Are you having real conversations with people? Are you reading? Are you watching? Are you listening? Are you centering the voices of those who are marginalized over your own? And so the work of empathy is recognizing, man, I've never thought to look at life through their perspective and to gain knowledge and to be more self-aware of how I'm behaving. And then the last part is cultural responsiveness, or compassion, which is empathy in action, or radical empathy. It's our desire to actually do something about it. So maybe your mom is in the stage of empathy, and maybe you're asking her to move into the stage of compassion. Like, Mom, what are you going to read? What are you going to do? How are you going to move this forward? And one of the 5 stages of compassion is recognizing those feelings of uncomfortability and moving past them. And so, but within that and developing compassion, it's our ability to actually create change. But a lot of times it's awareness. Go ahead.
Sorry, so I wanted to ask and turn it to you because, you know, I'm going to give an example, but then maybe you can share your own story too, because I know you're active in these conversations. Is, you know, typically when we talk about family gatherings or, you know, meeting people, we always say, oh, don't talk about politics, don't talk about race, don't talk about things that are, again, uncomfortable conversations, right? But I see you really engaging in these uncomfortable conversations in your communities. How do you do that? How do you say, I'm not going to not talk about race or talk about politics because it's uncomfortable, because we have to have those conversations? How do you do that?
It's a good question, and it's taken a long time for me to learn this. I will, you know, because people can't see us in this, I am a person of color. My dad is from India, so I'm a first-generation American. My mom is American. And so I grew up in this, what I thought for a long time was a neither nor, where I wasn't really American, because when Americans see me, they see my brown skin, they see my ethnicity, so they consider me Indian. But we know that there is, you know, well, every culture has its quirks. And for most of the Indian community, because I'm half American, I'm not Indian.
Right.
But I've decided, forget that, I'm going to move into the both and. And I think in doing that, it's also a stage of just integration, where I can move in and out of these identities. And I think which is part of cultural intelligence, are you able to just say, I'm going to be part of all of the communities that I belong to without apology? So in answering your question directly, I think that I have done the work of trying to learn as much about all of the facets of my identity as much as I can that I'm currently aware of, and engage those things wholeheartedly. And that's also the work, the self-awareness, that it's not so much, what can I learn about this other culture so I can just do what I need to do to be like them? No. What am I going to do to know what I am about myself, of what I know about myself, so I can be that much more aware of who I am, to understand how best to adapt to other cultures. And so when it comes to uncomfortable conversations, I think the first thing that I try to do, and I will say in extroversion, I go to 11, and people are my why. And so for me, it's natural to build relationships and to build trust. And then from there, then we can start asking those questions. And even in my Indian family, my husband happens to be white. You know, and when we went to my relative's house, at first he was really uncomfortable and kind of annoyed. And he finally, I noticed it and I was like, what's happening? What's going on? And he's like, well, why does it take 3 hours to say goodbye? And I was like, oh. And I was like, you know, I don't know. It just does. And it was one of those things that, so we've been married about 14 years, and this is 14 years ago, where I was still in my 20s. And I was like, I don't know why it takes 3 hours to say goodbye. It's just, that's how you show respect. You have to make sure you say goodbye to everybody. You say goodbye to everybody again. And so I had to figure that part out. And my husband was asking me out of a sense of frustration, but it was also out of a sense of acceptance, that I accept that I'm entering into this new cross-cultural situation. And he understood that he was the minority, but he still had this uncomfortability. And asking the question to me, the person he could trust, was important. And so I worked it out. And now we just start saying goodbye as soon as we enter, and we've made the best of both worlds. I'm just kidding. I don't know. I hope I've answered that, but really it's developing trust, building relationships, putting yourself into uncomfortable situations, asking better questions, but more than anything, getting to know yourself.
Yeah. So I think that may lead sort of into, maybe if you want to share more about the 3 CQ capabilities that you've been working on, and sort of how people can sort of move into these different spaces to allow them to kind of continue their journey with themselves about this topic.
Yeah. And so when we talk about, now this is all research-based and early in Angan. I give workshops on these, which I'm happy to do for people throughout ASU. But when we look at the 3 cultural capabilities, the first is cultural openness, which is this motivational cultural intelligence. It's the willingness to learn about and work with diverse others. So are you motivated to learn not just about others, but also about yourself?
And do you have any ways, sorry, I'm gonna maybe interrupt you for each one, but do you have any ways in which people can become more motivated or learn how to motivate themselves?
Well, I think it would be asking them questions. Are they uncomfortable? If they're uncomfortable, because remember, this is based in curiosity. Mm-hmm. This idea that some people are comfortable not going out of their circles. They're comfortable not understanding or not knowing. So maybe you would ask yourself, why? How motivated am I to move out of the foods that I eat, or the people I associate with, or any of those kinds of things? So I think there is a big element of self-awareness.
Yeah, great.
And so the second one is cultural awareness, which is the cognitive and even metacognitive aspect of cultural intelligence, or CQ, which is the active process of becoming well-informed of the interpersonal and cultural values of diverse individuals, and I would argue of yourself, because you can't really know that others are different until you understand what makes you who you are. And in here, there's 10 cultural values, which I won't go over today because they're extensive, but this idea that so often we judge people based on their not doing things the way we think things ought to be done. Mm-hmm. And we don't realize, whoa. The way so for instance, time. Being on time is not a right or wrong value. It is actually a cultural value. Mm-hmm. and it's nuanced. And so for you, if a sign of disrespect is showing up late, but for somebody from a different culture, being late is not really, in some cultures, you have a 15-minute window before lateness is not even a concept really for a lot of cultures. So that's not a sign of disrespect. For them, being disrespectful might be being so rigid on time that you don't allow for people to actually just be, right? So you see all these cultural nuances here. So I'm judging this person for being disrespectful based on a cultural value that they may not share.
Right. And so I think I think it's so important when we don't know those aspects of other cultural values or of cultures that may hold different cultural values is to expose ourselves to those things.
Yes.
I remember when in a class I taught a couple of years ago for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, for those that want some more context. One of the assignments I gave my students was to go into a space where they were not comfortable and just sit there for an hour and see what that felt like. So I said to them, if you're a Christian, go to a mosque. If you're not part of the LGBT community, go to a pride parade. If you're a vegetarian, go to a steakhouse. And again, they're just kind of simple examples, but just again, allowing the students to say, I'm going to go into a space that I don't normally go into. I don't know, but I want to sit there and observe, listen, watch, and learn. And we have to do that. There's so much that happens on our campus, all of our campus locations, that the opportunities for any of us to just be in a space that we're not traditionally in is vast. So we have to take advantage of that.
And Drew, I love that you're saying this because of this fact. So many people who are from minority communities, marginalized communities, feel like they're the only. So up until I grew up in Phoenix in the 70s and 80s. Up until third grade, I was the only brown person. And one Black family moved in, I think in first or third grade or something like that. I can't even remember. But I very much felt like the only. And when you look at the theory of belonging, this is universal. It's Baumeister and Leary. When you, every human being, except, and they make the exception, maybe sociopaths or psychopaths are not part of this, but for the most part, cross-culturally, we have the need to belong in order to feel seen and heard. And so for many of us who feel like we're the only, it's hard for us to feel like we belong. And so I love what you did with your class, because you were essentially asking them to put themselves in a place where they may have had to have been the only. And to experience, wow, this feels isolating, it feels uncomfortable. I maybe either don't feel seen, or I feel so seen, like all eyes are on me. And not everybody, that's not pleasant for a lot of people. Or I feel othered, or I feel like now I'm in the minority. And I really do think it's a fantastic place to be, maybe not permanently, but that's the thing that now, once you recognize that, you move into the third CQ capability, which is cultural responsiveness. And this is the behavioral aspect. This is the ability to plan for and to implement appropriate behaviors in response to diverse and multicultural opportunities and challenges. So it's for me to know, in working with people who identify as Muslim and who maybe specifically are from the Middle East, I recognize that even though I might consider myself a feminist within the United States, and I'm going to talk here a little bit about code switching. I'm a feminist in the United States. I'm my husband and I, we have an egalitarian relationship. And I feel like I can hold my own as a woman. However, when I move into cultures where men and women don't work together, where my being a woman may not come with as much power as it does in the United States, and even that's negotiable.
Yep.
I recognize that, like if a turbaned man comes in, especially one that's older than I am, I will put down my feminist standpoints and I will defer to that man, because that's my cultural mindset. That's my adaptability. And at the same time, when I interact with men from the Middle East, I don't extend my hand to shake, to honor them. This is that adaptability. This is that responsiveness, because I understand that it might put them at discomfort, knowing that within their cultural context, they may not have ever had the experience of working with women who are not their family members. And however, if they want to extend their hand to shake, by all means, I will, but I leave it to them. And a lot of people might say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make you very much a feminist. Yes, it does. I'm choosing to be culturally responsive and honor the other. And I'm happy to do that.
I'm going to maybe ask you to say your, which I know is kind of your phrase when we talk about this issue, but just I know there's that perspective, especially when we talk about students or other individuals coming to the U.S. or coming to ASU. There's sometimes a thought of, well, they've chosen to come here, so they need to adapt to this environment or this cultural value. So, what do you typically say to those individuals when they're saying that?
I say honor culture, invite acculturation.
And what does that mean?
That means, so let's say I'm an advisor at ASU and I prefer that my sessions are done individually, one-on-one. However, I realize that for several of the cultures that we serve, and the top 3 international cultures that we serve are China, India, and Saudi Arabia. And in many of these cultures, students prefer to attend things in groups. There's maybe the language issue, maybe one person is interpreting, and also they might be more comfortable in an interdependent society. Also, it's, hey, if we all have the same question, we should go together, right? So there's this practicality there too. So maybe these students will come to advising sessions in groups. Now the advisor's like, oh my gosh, I'm not comfortable with this. This is not how we do it. However, in recognizing that these students may have just gotten here, that these students are still adjusting not just culturally, but also linguistically, that maybe the advisor says, all right, I'm gonna honor culture. I'm gonna see you. I'm gonna say, listen, I get it. Yes, for this first session or the half the session, whatever, we're gonna do this as a group. But then I want to invite you to acculturate to ASU culture or the American culture, whatever, or my classroom culture or my office culture. See, all of these are different elements of culture, all 4 of those. And I'm gonna ask you next time to come by yourself. So we've done the both and, coming back to what I was saying. And also to remind everybody that you can't expect somebody, this is going back to those values, you can't expect somebody to operate by your value system if you haven't made those explicit. So have you told students or colleagues what it is that you expect in terms of policy? Because if you haven't, how can you expect them to quote unquote measure up to them? And then this comes back to this anti-racism comment or issue, that your policies should reflect equities. And so we're thinking about all of these things, they all come together. Is it a lot of work? Yes. Does it take time? Yes. Is it worth the time and effort? I would argue yes.
Absolutely. And again, if we go back to what we've been talking about, being uncomfortable, right? That advisor may be uncomfortable having that conversation, but that's okay. It is okay to be uncomfortable. We don't always have to be 100% comfortable in everything that we do. As the quote that we said at the beginning illustrates, we grow when we're uncomfortable. So think of how that experience could apply to that advisor outside their advising role. The learning opportunity that they might experience and growing from that and being uncomfortable, they may be able to apply that to so many other aspects of their life.
Yeah. And I think, going back to the question you asked me before, and how do you start these conversations about race, politics, religion, it's building relationships. So maybe the advisor just takes time to get to know the students. Some students have commented like, man, ASU is difficult when I go into these conversations because nobody asks about my family. And because in their cultures, it is very family oriented. And in ASU, we're like, well, this is a business setting. We don't talk about families. That's uncomfortable for us. But maybe we recognize, right, we need to feel seen. And sometimes if a person feels seen, then they're open to allow you to ask those uncomfortable questions within time. Even like the hijab, not asking why do you wear it, but what does it mean to you? So asking better questions. What does it mean for you to be a Christian? What does it mean for you to be part of this community? Or what was it like growing up in rural, name your town? This kind of thing where it's not this pointing at you like why or how, but tell me your story.
Right.
And then you learn so much from that.
Right. Because, and again, I think that's a great idea because it allows us to really treat people as individuals.
Yes.
Right. We do a lot of assuming generalizations or stereotyping, saying, well, I think all people are going to act like this. But if we don't ask these individuals their story, their experiences, where they're coming from, we're just treating them as a monolith to the group that we are assuming, that, or to the culture, actually, if we talk about the words we've been using today, we assume they're part of a culture that we think it to be, as opposed to just simply saying, tell me who you are. Tell me why you believe this. Tell me what your experience has been. And again, I think it goes back to your point about building that trust and those connections. The more that we do those, the more that we have those conversations, the more that we can learn, and then the more that we can become okay with being uncomfortable.
Yeah, so good. And wrapping back around to where we started with being uncomfortable right now with COVID and with politics and with masks and with the race, you know, recognizing in ourselves, if we find out that somebody is Republican or somebody is evangelical, do we automatically write them off? Because we know if we are Democrat or if we are non-Christian or non-evangelical, if you will. I will say, you know, I am a person of faith. I don't happen to be part of the evangelical community, but I will say right now, my instinctive instinct, well, they must be anti-mask, they must be and look, that is a lot of stereotypes that I am running off, and I'm owning the fact that I have egregiously been in error with that I cannot automatically assume somebody's mindset based on a bunch of labels. It is not right. It is not okay. And in doing this work, I might be really good at it in intercultural settings, but within my own American United States context with politics and religion, am I willing to extend the same grace with people who I feel fundamentally different? You know, and I'm uncomfortable even sharing all of this, but I feel like for the sake of being real in this conversation, I have to. And it's an ongoing process of saying, look, I can't say that you got to do this with these groups, and then I can't do it with a group that's making me very, very angry.
Right.
Because the entire group isn't making me angry. People are making me angry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's encourage each other to be curious, right? Yes. Encourage everyone to have empathy. Real empathy, not sympathy, but empathy. Yeah. Let's encourage ourselves to be compassionate, to listen. And it is okay. It is okay to be uncomfortable. It is okay to learn. It is okay to be challenged. Mm. We should all see ourselves as lifelong learners. And the more that we can just step back and say, I need to learn something. I want to learn something. I want to be better. Then we can move forward, I hope.
Yes, yes. And with that, Drew, I think that I really appreciate having had this conversation. I want to say thank you.
Thank you, Renee. I appreciate it as well.
Yes, and thank you to everybody who's listening. We hope that you will engage this conversation in whatever way you can.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. In addition to being present here, CCI invites you to join our mailing list by emailing us at ccicontact@asu.edu and visit our website at inclusion.asu.edu/CCI.